Samuel Alito smirked, his thin lips curling as though the weight of history was merely a game for him to manipulate. It wasn't just a casual twitch of amusement, it was deliberate, a gesture sharp enough to cut the silence that blanketed the courtroom. The cameras caught it instantly, magnifying every fraction of a second, every twitch of his jaw, replaying the look to millions of Americans who had grown weary of these moments yet couldn't look away. The smirk didn't belong to a man idly entertained, it belonged to someone who knew more than he let on, someone who relished the chaos his silence would create. Jasmine Crockett, seated nearby, felt the air shift. She was no stranger to firestorms, no stranger to confrontation. Her reputation had been built on calling out hypocrisy with unrelenting precision. Yet for once, the sharpness in her eyes dulled into something unfamiliar, hesitation. Her chest tightened as if the smirk itself carried an unspoken threat. She didn't flinch outwardly, she wouldn't give Alito that satisfaction, but she shifted in her seat, her usually steady hands clasping tighter than before. She knew what millions were already whispering in private. This wasn't arrogance, it was a signal. Something was brewing beneath the surface, something that could not be contained within these marble walls. The courtroom, packed with reporters, lawyers, and political operatives, seemed to hold its breath. No one dared break the silence because they could all feel it, that tension that comes before history cracks open. Phones buzzed in laps, aides glanced nervously at their screens, but no one spoke. Then, as if on cue, the outside world crashed in. Breaking news alerts flooded across televisions and smartphones, cutting into programming coast to coast. Anchors, normally composed, stumbled over their words as the first reports spilled out. Donald Trump, the man whose very presence had once electrified red states into roaring seas of loyalty, was faltering. At first, the news anchors spoke carefully, almost cautiously. But as more information trickled in, the words grew heavier, sharper, impossible to soften. Signs of decline, unexpected weakness, potentially fatal. The phrase that would dominate the next 24 hours blared across every screen: Trump shows fatal signs. The nation, already fractured, now trembled at its core. For years, Trump had presented himself as indestructible, louder than his rivals, tougher than his critics, a figure who could not be broken. But in the heart of a furious red state, where his rallies once drowned entire towns in chants of devotion, cracks were showing. Whispers turned into frantic speculation. He had faltered at a closed-door meeting, his health was worse than insiders admitted, his fiery energy, the fuel of his political survival, was finally burning out. Reporters outside the courthouse screamed questions into microphones, their voices overlapping into chaos. Headlines flashed with urgency, breaking down every rumor, every angle, as though each update carried the weight of national security. Crowds began to gather in streets far beyond the courthouse, watching giant screens replay the smirk of Alito, the silence of Crockett, and the disturbing footage of Trump's sudden weakness. In that collision of images, the smirk, the panic, the falter, a dangerous narrative took shape. This wasn't merely about one man's health. This was about control, power, and the unraveling of a movement that had dominated American politics for nearly a decade. Inside, Jasmine Crockett's unease grew. She could hear the faint buzz of updates being whispered between aides at the back of the room. She could sense the fear rippling through her colleagues, fear not of Trump himself, but of what would happen if. The myth of his invincibility collapsed in real time. The man whose presence had anchored millions of Americans now appeared vulnerable, and when strongmen appear weak, their followers rarely accept it quietly. Across the country, the fallout was immediate. Red state strongholds that once brimmed with chants of loyalty now simmered with confusion and dread. Some supporters rushed to defend him, insisting the reports were lies, fabrications meant to destroy him. Others, quieter but growing louder by the hour, admitted what they feared, that something irreversible was happening. And yet, amid the swirl of panic, Alito's smirk replayed endlessly on television screens, fusing itself into the unfolding crisis. To many, it felt like mockery, a judge delighting in national chaos. To others, it looked like prophecy, as though he knew where this road would end. Whatever it meant, the timing was undeniable. The smirk and Trump's sudden decline were no longer separate events. They had collided, and the nation could not unsee it. The silence in the courtroom, the chaos outside, the headlines blaring fatal signs, it all fused into one chilling reality. Something irreversible had begun. Crockett's panic deepened as the storm outside swelled into something uncontainable. She wasn't afraid for herself, she was too seasoned for that, but she feared what the unraveling of Trump's myth would do to the fragile state of the nation. In the courtroom, she pressed her palms against the table, her nails digging slightly into the wood as she tried to steady her breathing. She had seen chaos before, but this was different. The updates flashing across her aids, phones weren't just political gossip. They were warnings of a fire spreading faster than anyone could control. In the furious red state once seen as Trump's impenetrable fortress, chaos had erupted. Town halls that were usually stages for orchestrated loyalty turned into battlegrounds. Local officials were shouted down by angry crowds demanding answers. People who once stood shoulder to shoulder in MAGA hats were suddenly at odds, some screaming that the reports of Trump's decline were fabrications, others insisting they had seen the truth with their own eyes. "He couldn't even stand," shouted one witness to a packed audience, his voice trembling with rage. "He's not the man he was." The room split instantly, half chanting, "Fake news," and the other half growing restless with fear. Hospitals, too, became unwilling players in the drama. Rumors of Trump being rushed into treatment were whispered in emergency rooms, though no official confirmations came. The absence of clear information only fueled the fire. Anonymous leaks claimed his voice faltered during private calls, that his steps were slower, his hands shaking. Social media churned these fragments into terrifying headlines. To his most devoted followers, denial became a weapon. They rejected every report, every clip, labeling it part of a coordinated takedown. But beneath their fury, even they felt it, the unease of watching a symbol of strength suddenly teeter. Violent clashes began to break out across the red state. Supporters clashed not with outsiders, but with each other. In some towns, gunshots rang out after arguments escalated. Family members, once united by politics, now fought bitterly in public squares. "If he's weak, then America is weak," one man screamed into a news camera before shoving another protester to the ground. These weren't isolated skirmishes, they were symptoms of a movement eating itself alive. Back in Washington, Crockett scrolled through updates handed to her, each more alarming than the last. Aides whispered frantically, governors calling for calm, law enforcement overwhelmed, rumors that militias were mobilizing to defend Trump against invisible enemies. Even members of Trump's inner circle seemed shaken. Some appeared on television visibly flustered, struggling to spin the story. Others went silent entirely, retreating from the spotlight. The empire that had once operated with a single booming voice now sounded fractured, confused, uncertain. And all the while, the image of Alito's smirk haunted her. Replay after replay on television turned that simple gesture into a symbol. For many, it became the face of arrogance in power, mocking a nation's unraveling. For others, it was read as foreshadowing, a knowing grin from a man who understood that the collapse was inevitable. Crockett couldn't shake the thought. Was he smirking because he knew Trump's fall would drag the entire country with him? Crowds swelled outside the courthouse, chanting, screaming, waving signs that shifted rapidly from messages of loyalty to desperate pleas for clarity. "Tell us the truth," one banner demanded. Another simply read, "If he falls, we all fall." The panic wasn't contained to one state anymore. The ripple spread across the country. Blue states braced for unrest, swing states trembled at the thought of violence, and red states became pressure cookers ready to explode. Crockett, though panicked, understood the depth of what was unfolding. This wasn't merely about Donald Trump's health or his political future. It was about the fragility of a nation that had hitched its identity to one man. Without him standing strong, millions felt leaderless, abandoned, and betrayed. When leaders falter, followers don't always mourn, they rage. And rage was now spilling into the streets. Every television station ran the same chilling montage. Trump struggling in footage, Alito's smirk, Crockett's tense expression, and the swelling crowds chanting in anger. Together, it painted a picture of a country on the edge of collapse. World leaders issued cautious statements, financial markets rattled, and military officials quietly raised security levels. No one wanted to say it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. America's instability was no longer theoretical, it was happening in real time. As Crockett looked out into the courtroom, she realized that the panic she felt wasn't hers alone. The entire nation was sharing it with her, a collective dread that history was shifting under their feet. Trump's fatal signs weren't confined to his body or his career. They were spreading into the veins of the republic itself, threatening to tear apart everything holding it together. And somewhere in the shadows of power, Samuel Alito's smirk lingered, replaying endlessly like a warning. The fall of one man could ignite the collapse of an empire. Dash dash dash.